4 a.m., a stolen jet, $80 million in gold, and a young African president who walked into the darkness alone. While the world slept, a silent crime was unfolding on the runway of a forgotten nation. A crime backed by suits, sealed by stamps, and protected by silence. The powerful thought they had already won, that no one would notice, that no one would dare stand in the way. But one man noticed, one man waited, and when the moment came, he didn't send a drone or give a speech. He showed up himself. This is not a documentary. This is not the news. But the anger is real, the injustice is real, and the question is very real. What would you do if justice depended on just one man? And that man was you? This story is inspired by real-world injustices, systems of exploitation, and the hope that even in fiction, truth can speak louder than silence. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, 3:47 a.m. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with secrets. The kind that moved silently between men in suits and soldiers who'd been paid to look the other way. At the far end of the tarmac, half buried in the fog of early dawn, a sleek Gulfstream G650 sat waiting like a silver predator. Its polished wings shimmered under the harsh industrial lights, lights that would flicker just once before the entire world shifted. Its engines hummed low, like a growl beneath its breath, not quite ready to leap but fully aware of the power it held. Near the cargo hatch, crates the size of small coffins were being loaded one by one, unmarked, unscanned, unspoken. Each was heavier than it looked, and none of the men handling them dared ask why. A nearby customs officer yawned, not because he was tired, but because he was bored. Or at least, that's what he told himself. His clipboard bore all the right stamps: diplomatic seal, clearance code, embassy authorization. He'd seen the paperwork hours ago and signed it without blinking. Why would he question it now? Inside the VIP terminal, beyond a double layer of tinted glass, 3 men in designer suits stood watching. One held a glass of champagne that sparkled like liquid gold under the chandelier. His tie was silk imported from Italy, his conscience long since exported elsewhere. "To success," he muttered, raising his glass. "To silence," the second replied. The third only smiled. They believed this was it, the final piece. The last move in a game they'd been playing for years, manipulating contracts, paying off ministers, silencing dissent. In just 10 minutes, that jet would be airborne, carrying over $80 million in smelted gold, destined for Geneva, Switzerland. Once there, it would vanish, washed clean through offshore banks and shell companies, never to be traced again. It was, by all appearances, the perfect crime. And yet, something was off. If you listened carefully, past the noise of the engines, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of boots, there was a strange stillness, as if the night itself was holding its breath. A shadow moved behind a tower in the distance. Not fast, deliberate, watching. A security guard at Gate C lit a cigarette. His lighter flicked 3 times before catching. He glanced at his phone. No signal. Odd, he thought, then shrugged. Back at the aircraft, the last crate was being loaded. This one bore a red mark on the corner. Unusual. A technician furrowed his brow. "Should we report that?" he asked. "No questions tonight," came the reply. "Not for this flight." High above, a single security camera rotated, its lens zooming in silently on a signature. The customs directors scribbled in shaky ink just hours earlier. In the control tower, the flight supervisor tapped his foot. He had already authorized takeoff. Everything checked out, but he couldn't shake a strange feeling in his gut. Something about this didn't feel right. He turned to the assistant. "Where's the backup manifest?" "You signed it already." "No, the second one. The sealed copy, silence." Still, he said nothing, just like always. Because that's how these things worked. Say nothing. Sign everything. Go home. And far from the spotlight, in a small, unlit room on the other side of the airport, a monitor blinked to life. A green dot on the screen flashed red. Someone was watching. Someone who had waited for this exact moment. Someone who had counted every crate, memorized every name, timed every move down to the second. And just as the pilot slid on his headset and began the pre-flight sequence, a light on his console flickered, then died. One light, then another. Then the entire runway plunged into darkness. Total, paralyzing black. For the men in the terminal, champagne halfway to their lips, it was an inconvenience, a glitch. For the customs officer on the tarmac, it was confusing. For the pilot, it was a technical nightmare. But for Ibrahim Traoré, watching from the shadows, it was a signal. A single silent answer to a question that had haunted his nights. Can justice still arrive in a place where silence has always won? He wasn't just going to stop the plane. He was going to make the entire world watch. Rewind the clock 3 weeks. By the time the plane touched Burkina Faso's tarmac that night, the operation had already been in motion for months, designed with the precision of a military campaign, but executed in the shadows of bureaucracy and bribes. It didn't begin with gold or even the jet. It began as most perfect crimes do, with a single conversation behind a closed door. In a private boardroom in Geneva, far from the dusty heat of West Africa, Marcus Vogel, a Swiss metals broker with a reputation for making dirty things disappear cleanly, sat across from two men with polished shoes and cold eyes. One was the Minister of Commerce for Burkina Faso, the other a legal consultant with dual passports and no fixed address. They didn't talk about gold, not directly. They spoke in code. Inventory optimization, asset relocation, sovereign liquidity. But the meaning was clear. The Topaco mine, supposedly shut down after a political audit, was still very much active, and its underground veins were still bleeding gold. The problem wasn't extraction. That was easy. The mine was guarded by private contractors, off the books, paid in untraceable crypto through third-party firms registered in Cyprus. The workers were underpaid, invisible, and desperate. Trucks moved at night. Smelting was done in a remote facility camouflaged as a cement plant. The real challenge was getting the gold out without setting off alarms. That's where Benoit Traoré, no relation to the president, came in. A seasoned customs director, Benoit was fluent in 2 languages, legal protocol and the price of silence. He'd been on the payroll of various interests for over a decade, carefully avoiding scandal, always knowing when to look the other way, and, more importantly, when not to. He was the one who signed off on the diplomatic cargo designation, a status that would shield the crates from inspection, even by airport security. He was also the one who recommended using a specific Swiss-registered jet known for discretion, outfitted with custom cargo holds and a tail number linked to a shell company owned by a cousin of a former prime minister. Next came the paperwork. Dozens of forged documents, all mirroring legitimate forms down to the font and ink color, passed through the Ministry of Commerce. These included mining export permits, geological sample declarations, and consular certifications from a European embassy whose ambassador hadn't set foot in Ouagadougou in 6 months. But his stamp had. Every form passed, every seal held. No one questioned why the export of mining samples required armed guards and late-night handling. That's the genius of institutional corruption. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It drips into systems slowly until silence becomes policy and paperwork becomes prophecy. 1 week before the flight, a final meeting took place in a luxury villa just outside the capital. Marcus Vogel flew in under diplomatic cover, checked into a 5-star hotel, and met privately with 3 key players: the minister, Benoit the customs chief, and a military logistics officer whose uniform bore no name tag. The conversation was brief. The crates will be ready. The flight crew is on payroll? Of course. And the president? A pause. He's young, idealistic. He won't see it. And that was their fatal mistake. They mistook silence for ignorance, inaction for consent. They thought a man who didn't speak didn't know. They even held a toast that night, under the heavy stars of Burkina Faso's dry season. Crystal glasses clinked over an outdoor table as the jet's coordinates were locked into the flight plan. Geneva, with a stopover in Morocco. Arrival time, 9:25 local time. Cheers to the last shipment, Vogel said. After this, the minister smiled, we're ghosts. But ghosts, no matter how carefully they plan their escape, still leave shadows, and someone quiet, young, and watching had already begun to follow them through the dark. At the presidential compound, far from the clinking glasses and forged documents, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in a modest, dimly lit study, his back straight, eyes fixed on a screen. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the old ceiling fan and the subtle flicker of surveillance footage looping across a monitor. Grainy, silent, damning. The president's office was nothing like what most imagine. No marble floors, no gold-trimmed bookshelves, just a simple wooden desk, a worn national flag pinned above it, and a stack of reports scribbled over in his own tight handwriting. On a shelf nearby, a framed photo showed him in uniform, mud-covered, sweat-soaked, surrounded by soldiers not much older than high school students. The image had gone viral after the coup, hailed by some as heroic, condemned by others as dangerous. But Traoré never mentioned it. He didn't need to. He wasn't the kind of leader who spoke unless necessary. He listened to ministers who underestimated him, to diplomats who praised him with veiled condescension, to soldiers who carried scars they never showed, and most of all, to silence. The kind of silence that follows stolen money, the kind that hides behind false paperwork and late-night flights. For weeks he had said nothing, watched but said nothing. Not when the Ministry of Commerce approved a suspicious permit, not when the tobacco mine's energy usage inexplicably spiked, not even when his own intelligence chief whispered, "Sir, this could go to the top." He simply nodded, took notes, waited. In public, he maintained his usual composure, calm, modest, restrained. He drove himself to official meetings in the same 10-year-old Land Cruiser he'd used before taking power. He shook hands with villagers and listened as school teachers apologized for not having enough chalk. He took tea with elders who remembered the country before coup became currency. They told him the same thing again and again: don't become like the others. But at night, when the compound went quiet, Traoré would return to his screen. Watch the crates, the names, the dates. He was piecing together something no one else had the patience, or perhaps the courage, to see. What they didn't understand was that Ibrahim Traoré wasn't paralyzed by the weight of corruption. He was fueled by it. He didn't act because he doubted. He waited because he knew that systems this rotten didn't collapse with speeches or press conferences. They required timing, exposure, and a single, undeniable moment that no one could ignore. That moment was coming. Outside, the dry wind swept through the palace courtyard, carrying with it the scent of dust and night-blooming jasmine. Inside, Traoré turned to his aide, a quiet man who had stood with him since the coup, and spoke softly, almost like an afterthought. "They think I don't know." Burkina Faso was not always a land of broken things. It had once dreamed, loudly and without fear, of independence, of unity, of lifting its people out of the dust and into dignity. But over the years, those dreams had been slowly dismantled, not by war, but by something colder: neglect. Promises were made, headlines were printed, slogans were shouted into microphones, and then quietly forgotten. One by one. The result was a country where the cracks weren't just in the pavement, but in the soul of its institutions. In the north, schools stood like skeletons, cement frames with missing roofs, no doors, no glass in the windows. Desks were rare, textbooks rarer. In one village, a teacher showed up every morning with a piece of chalk broken in half, the same piece she'd used for weeks. Her students, barefoot, hungry, and impossibly eager, sat on dirt floors, scribbling in the margins of old newspapers, learning letters that might never spell opportunity. In the Central Plains, hospitals operated on hope rather than supplies. Entire wards lacked bandages, antibiotics, electricity. Doctors stitched wounds by candlelight. A midwife in a rural clinic confessed to boiling water over open fire just to clean instruments. The sign outside the building read National Health Center. The only thing national about it was the suffering inside. And in the markets, if you could call them that, children sold roasted maize from rusted pans, their faces smudged with ash. For many, that dry kernel of corn would be their only meal of the day. They smiled anyway, because they were children, because they didn't yet know that the game had been rigged long before they were born. Ibrahim Traoré had seen all of this, not from the windows of a tinted SUV or the polished floors of a donor-funded conference. He had walked through the villages himself, unannounced, without cameras, his boots coated in red earth, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't travel with an entourage of ministers, only 2 aides and a notebook he carried in his pocket. In it, he wrote names, stories, numbers. At one school, he watched as a girl tried to calculate fractions using pebbles. Her handwriting was careful, her eyes focused, her feet bruised. She looked up at him once, unsure who he was, and smiled. That smile stayed with him long after he left. In another town, a farmer brought him to a cracked well. Dry since the previous rainy season, he pointed to the sky as if hoping the clouds would hear. Traoré knelt beside him, dipped a hand into the dusty basin, and said nothing. The farmer didn't ask for help. He asked a question. "Do you think my grandson will still be here in 10 years? It wasn't just a question about climate or migration. It was about hope, about whether there was still a country left to believe in. Everywhere he went, Traoré listened. Not for applause, not for votes, for truth, for evidence of how far the rot had spread. And the deeper he looked, the more he understood. Corruption wasn't just stealing money. It was stealing futures. It was robbing generations before they even had a chance. And yet, in all the despair, something flickered. Not loudly, but stubbornly. It was in the cracked chalkboard, the ash-covered maze, the dry well. Something was still alive. So when he sat quietly in his study each night, watching grainy footage of a jet being prepared in secret, his anger wasn't theatrical, it was personal. Because the crates on that runway didn't just carry stolen gold. They carried the cost of every broken promise. The sun had long disappeared behind the dusty skyline of Ouagadougou by the time Ibrahim Traoré returned to the presidential residence. The compound, while secure, was far from opulent. It had been built decades ago, during a different regime, and although renovations had been suggested repeatedly by staff and advisors, Traoré had refused. He insisted on keeping the cracked tiles, the old furniture, the flickering hallway lights, reminders of a country still mending itself. Power, he believed, should not be insulated by marble. He walked slowly through the corridor that led to his study, a hallway lined with oil portraits of the men who had come before him. One by one, they looked down on him, smiling, dignified, draped in ceremonial sashes. Some had been generals, others civilians in fine suits. All had promised change, and nearly all had left richer than they arrived. He paused in front of one particular portrait. The man in it had served for nearly a decade, rising through the ranks with fiery speeches and populist flair, only to leave the country billions in debt and its people begging for bread. The irony wasn't lost on Traoré. "Every one of them looks like a father of the nation," he murmured, "but the people were orphaned." He turned his gaze away and entered his office, a room he often called the war room, though no battles were fought there, only quiet ones. On his desk lay the reports he had carried with him from his latest trip: education surveys, water access maps, grain yield data. But what drew his eyes tonight wasn't any of those. It was a handwritten note slipped into a folder labeled Tobacco Mining. It was short, unsigned, but damning. It named names, times, places, a flight number. Traoré sank into his chair, his fingers tightening around the page. This wasn't the first whisper of corruption he'd received, not even the first this week, but it was the most specific. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like an old familiar cloak. Power, he had learned, wasn't in giving orders. It was in deciding which truth to act on and which to bear in silence. And the longer he held power, the more he understood the loneliness of it. His ministers smiled too much. His cabinet talked in circles. Even some of his generals, once allies during the uprising, now flinched when he asked hard questions. They were learning to fear him, not for his authority, but for his unwillingness to play along. So he stopped asking. Instead, he started watching. He instructed a small team, hand-picked, loyal, quiet, to begin collecting digital traffic from the Ministry of Commerce. He ordered micro cameras installed near the customs office. He secured access to flight logs from the control tower under the pretense of aviation safety. No memos were issued, no files were stamped. Every piece of intelligence came through side channels, through men and women who didn't wear suits but knew how to blend into them. Each night, he stayed up hours past midnight, reviewing intercepted emails, blurred surveillance stills, cargo manifests sent to unofficial inboxes. He said nothing to his advisors, nothing to the press. He barely even mentioned it to his aide, because something deeper than suspicion was building. It was the grim certainty that the very machine he now commanded had been wired for theft, long before he ever touched the controls. And to disarm it, he couldn't just shout. He had to learn its language. The pauses in a report, the delay in a signature, the way a minister avoided eye contact when asked a simple question. Some nights he caught himself wondering if he had changed, if the silence had started turning him into the very thing he swore to fight. After all, wasn't silence the trait of tyrants too? He stared again at the wall of portraits. What made them fall? He asked himself. And then came the harder question, how will I be different? The answer wasn't in the speeches he gave or the slogans he avoided. It was in what he was willing to risk without anyone ever knowing, in how much truth he was willing to hold, alone until it could no longer be denied. Back at his desk, he lit a small reading lamp and opened a fresh page in his notebook. He began to write names. Again. One of them was already circled. In a quiet village near the Ghanaian border, where the roads turned to dust before they reached any map, a man once called Colonel Misao had tried to forget who he used to be. His days were now simple. Teach history at the local school, repair old radios, tend to a modest garden behind a mud brick house. The children called him maître, not colonel, and he never corrected them. To them, he was just the quiet man with the scar across his cheek and a voice like Riverstone. Years earlier, Sao had stood at the center of a scandal that never made the papers. He had been ordered, by a president now long gone, to secure a convoy carrying illegal arms in exchange for foreign bribes. He refused, publicly, and for that, he was stripped of his rank, exiled under the guise of voluntary retirement, and warned never to step foot near the capital again. Most men would have broken. Sao simply vanished. Until the phone rang at 2:03 a.m. He answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting for it. "Me?" came the voice on the other end. "It's time to come home." There was a long silence. Then, "To the end, Mr. President." The call ended without further detail. None was needed. Sao packed no bag. He changed into the only uniform he kept, still ironed, still folded beneath his bed. By dawn, he was already on the road, his boots carrying the weight of memory and unfinished duty. Back in Ouagadougou, the wheels began to turn, slowly but without noise. No official decrees, no midnight arrests, just messages, coded, careful, and trusted only to hands that had once bled for the same cause. Sao didn't summon elites or high-ranking generals. He reached for men whose names never made headlines. Field medics who once boiled water in helmets, radio techs who fixed transmitters with wire scavenged from radios, infantrymen who had once stood knee-deep in mud just to defend a polling station no one reported on. They answered without hesitation, because they remembered. They remembered the revolution that had lifted Traoré not by politics, but by sacrifice. They remembered nights of hunger, betrayal, and frost-bitten loyalty. And they remembered that when others took credit, Traoré shared bread. One by one they returned, on foot, on bikes. Some hitching rides under false names. Not in uniforms, not with weapons, just with silence and resolve. They slept on floors, in basements, in abandoned barracks, waiting, listening. And Sao, their silent commander, built what no modern government ever feared most. A network with no titles, no ranks, no corruption, only belief. There was no written plan, no schedule, just one shared understanding passed from voice to voice, eye to eye. When the lights go out, move. They didn't need to know why. They trusted the W. From the outside, Tobacco Mine looked exactly as it should. Dead. The government had announced its closure nearly a year ago, citing resource exhaustion, and financial mismanagement. Rusted machinery sat still in the sun. The guardhouse at the main gate was locked, overgrown with weeds. The road leading in was cracked and dry. On paper, the site had been decommissioned, the workforce reassigned, and the tunnels sealed. But Colonel Sal knew better than to trust paper. He didn't approach the mine directly. That would be reckless. Instead, he set up observation from a remote hill 3 kilometers east, using an abandoned ranger's hut as his base. There, his team installed a small relay system powered by car batteries and rigged with military-grade night vision cameras, salvaged from a decade-old UN mission. With the help of a friendly technician still working within the National Telecom Office, they hacked into the satellite uplink once used for topographic mapping. Every night, images were captured, compiled, studied frame by frame. The first week showed nothing unusual, just wind and sand and stillness. But on the 8th night, the first truck appeared. No headlights, just a slow crawl across the edge of the fence line, entering through a break in the western perimeter. Not the main gate, but a back access road hidden behind dry brush and eroded hills. The vehicle idled for 20 minutes before 2 others joined it. Then, one by one, they descended into the mine. The next morning, Sal's team flew a drone over the site. What they saw contradicted every public report. The access tunnel, supposedly collapsed, was wide open. A new structure, half camouflaged under tarps and dirt, had been built over the shaft entrance. A large pipe, likely for ventilation or dust control, stretched into the hillside. Beside it sat 2 mobile generators, still warm when inspected with thermal imaging. They had seen enough to suspect, but Sal wanted proof. Over the next 10 days, they recorded more movements. The trucks came and went only between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., always in pairs, always the same route. Using infrared scans, they confirmed that the returning vehicles were several tons heavier than when they entered. Once, the tailgate of a flatbed didn't shut fully. From the still frame, they extracted a shape, a blurred outline, but unmistakable in its form. A brick the size of a hand, edges clean, surface polished. They enhanced the image. There it was, a smelted gold ingot. Sal remained silent. No calls to the president, no premature reports. He knew better than to tip the balance too soon. The operation had scale, it had rhythm, it had backing. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was organized extraction, and someone very high up was letting it happen. By the 3rd week, Sal's team had mapped the full underground network. Using seismic activity sensors and vibration modeling, they discovered that new tunnels had been dug, branching away from the original mine shaft into private land owned by a shell company registered in Senegal. That land, they learned, had recently received a foreign development grant for agricultural innovation. There were no crops, just cover stories. Every thread led to another. The trucks were registered under a transport firm operating in Ivory Coast. On paper, a fruit exporter. The mobile smelting unit they traced to a mining supply chain partner in Dubai. Even the security firm guarding the site had connections to a private military company used in past conflict zones. This wasn't just corruption, it was a parallel economy, operating beneath the nation's surface, literally. Sal stood one morning, staring at a satellite printout taped to the wall. It showed the mine, the tunnels, the truck paths, red lines like blood vessels branching from a poisoned heart. He knew the operation was almost complete. The schedule was tightening. The shipments were getting bigger. They were preparing for something. And then one of his men entered the room, holding a fresh satellite capture. A private jet, the same Gulfstream G650, had landed at the private hangar 3 days ahead of schedule. They're accelerating, Sal said. Why? Because they know something's closing in. He didn't need to say what. He picked up the secured line. It was time to call the president. In the world of gold smuggling, moving the metal is only half the operation. The other half, the more delicate, more dangerous half, is moving the money. And no one did that better than the invisible men in tailored suits, operating from glass towers, oceans away from the dust and blood that fed their profits. Colonel Sal's team, through a series of encrypted data leaks and intercepted invoices, had traced the trail of wealth that began with the Topako mine and ended in the heart of Geneva's private banking district. The route was complex by design, First, the raw gold was smelted locally in off-grid furnaces outside Ouagadougou. From there, it was molded into uniform bricks, stamped not with government insignia, but with the marks of independent artisanal cooperatives, a legal loophole that allowed the metal to bypass formal export taxes. These markings were forged with stunning precision, produced by a small engraving machine imported for educational purposes under the name of a fake NGO. Once disguised, the gold entered the international circuit via Côte d'Ivoire. At the border, drivers handed over falsified export certificates to customs officers who had long since stopped asking questions. In Abidjan, the cargo was transferred into shipping containers, then flown under diplomatic cover to Georgetown, Cayman Islands, aboard private jets hired by a logistics company registered under the name Makira Global Holdings. Makira did not exist, at least not in any real-world sense. It had no employees, no physical office, and no board of directors, just a website, a virtual mailing address, and a network of offshore accounts designed to absorb and obscure. The company had been incorporated by a Luxembourg-based firm that specialized in what they called risk-tolerant asset architecture, code for laundering on demand. From Cayman, the money took a new shape. Gold was sold to buyers in Hong Kong, who immediately resold it at inflated value to a Swiss metals firm, Berthel and Lang, with a long, discrete history of processing ethically questionable minerals under the banner of global commerce. The transactions were perfectly legal on paper. Purchase agreements were signed, taxes were paid, paper trails were created, then buried under layers of shell companies. The money now looked clean, untainted by African soil, washed in the invisible hands of international finance. But buried in the metadata of one of the Berthel and Lang wire transfers, Sao's analysts found a key fragment, an internal reference code linked to a payment routed through Banque de Sion, a private bank headquartered in Geneva, known for managing ultra-high net worth accounts with absolute discretion. One of those accounts had been opened 6 years earlier by a man named Marcus Vogel. Vogel was more than a banker. He was a facilitator, a broker of silence, a connector of worlds that weren't supposed to touch. He dined with politicians in Brussels, skied with oil executives in the Alps, and sent encrypted voice notes to West African ministers who called him partner. His fingerprints weren't on any gold bar, but his code names, his companies, his subtle fingerprints ran through the entire architecture of the scheme like veins through marble. Sao realized then what Traoré already suspected. This wasn't just a local betrayal, it was global. The corruption was woven into the fabric of international systems, designed to look clean while functioning dirty. And behind every transaction, every forged stamp, every discrete shipment logged as geological research samples, stood a wall of men in tailored suits, ready to swear under oath that they knew nothing, that they only moved money, not meaning. In one intercepted email, a customs officer in Burkina Faso asked a representative from the Geneva firm if everything was safe. The reply was simple: safer than your country's schools. It wasn't just a slap in the face. It was the doctrine of impunity made explicit, and it told Sao all he needed to know. They weren't just stealing gold. They were betting that no one in Burkina Faso would ever be bold or clean enough to stop them. But this time, they had miscalculated. There was a president who wasn't for sale, a colonel who wasn't afraid, and a silent network slowly tightening the noose. The final signature was made on a Friday afternoon. A nondescript man in a gray suit, his mortgage mysteriously paid off 2 weeks prior, walked through the silent corridors of the Ministry of Commerce. In his hand was a folder labeled Export Category B, Technical Mineral Equipment. Inside, neatly stacked, were the final permits that would allow several crates, each weighing nearly a quarter ton, to be loaded onto a jet without inspection, under the veil of diplomatic immunity. Everything had gone according to plan. The paperwork bore the right stamps: ministry, customs, even a European consulate. The seals shimmered under the afternoon light like metals of deceit. The operation had become so smooth, so mechanical, that no one even flinched anymore. It had become routine, as if stealing a nation's wealth was just another clerical task. By 5:17 p.m., the authorization had cleared all internal systems. A copy was sent to airport control for sensitive overnight handling. The manifest listed geological samples, high-value technical components, and diplomatic research tools. No one looked twice. No one ever did. The jet was scheduled for Sunday night, timed perfectly between low-traffic windows. The pilot crew, Swiss nationals with spotless records, had been briefed on discretion. They knew only what they needed: fly in, fly out, ask no questions. Their employer, a holding company out of Liechtenstein, specialized in international discretion services. The payment for this flight had cleared through a Hong Kong account 3 days earlier. Flagged nowhere. At the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the same papers, the same flight path, the same permits. He sat in his study, the lamplight soft on his face, one hand on his chin, the other gently tapping a pen against the edge of the desk. Across from him stood Colonel Cao, arms crossed, eyes scanning the details. "It's confirmed," Cao said. "They're ready to move." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He stared at the manifest a moment longer, then leaned back slowly, exhaled once, and said the words he had been holding in his chest for weeks. "Let them feel safe. Then we take everything." No dramatic orders followed. No troops were mobilized in the open. No press statements were issued. The silence was deliberate, measured. It was the kind of silence that made the enemy overconfident. By Saturday morning, the conspirators were already congratulating one another. A private dinner was arranged at a villa outside the city. The champagne had been ordered. One of the foreign operatives messaged a colleague in Geneva with a single line: "Wheels up Sunday." Done deal. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that every email, every permit, every whispered toast was already being logged, photographed, and placed carefully into an unmarked folder that now sat on the president's desk. The clock was ticking, and they weren't the only ones watching it. Sunday night arrived without ceremony. The heat had finally relented, and a thin fog clung to the runway of Ouagadougou International Airport like a whisper refusing to lift. From a distance, the facility looked asleep. Terminal lights dimmed, minimal personnel on duty, the main flight schedule showing nothing of interest. But beneath that hush was a machine in motion, smooth and silent. At the edge of the private cargo terminal, the Gulfstream G650 sat poised like a predator ready to pounce. Its polished fuselage reflected the few amber lights still flickering above the tarmac, and from its underbelly the cargo hatch remained open. Inviting, unbothered, unquestioned. One by one, the crates were loaded. Each was the size of a coffin, unmarked save for a generic shipping label and a diplomatic seal from a European embassy. No scanners were used, no questions asked. The crew moving them looked bored, contracted workers paid in cash, told only to follow instructions and not think too hard. Near the security checkpoint, a customs officer sat behind a plastic desk, stamping manifests without reading them. He flipped a page, pressed the seal, moved on. His eyes were glazed, perhaps from fatigue, perhaps from money, probably both. The shift had been handpicked by design, men with just enough authority to let things through, and just little enough curiosity to never wonder why. At 12:46 a.m., a sleek black SUV rolled up to the VIP lounge, its windows tinted, its arrival unannounced. Inside were three men, sharp suits, silk ties, and expressions like closed vaults. The first, Marcus Vogel, sipped bottled water and checked his phone. The second, the Minister of Commerce, adjusted his collar nervously, though the air conditioning was cold. The third, a representative from the Swiss logistics firm, was already on a call. "Flight confirmed. Takeoff window is clean. Geneva ready by 0900. In the VIP lounge, champagne had already been poured. Not too much. Nothing flashy. These men knew how to celebrate without leaving fingerprints. They sat in plush armchairs, half watching the loading process through tall glass windows. Outside, the runway shimmered faintly under low light, heat still rising from its surface like breath from sleeping giants. "So," Vogel said, raising his glass, "to smooth exits," the minister smirked, "to clean hands." They clinked glasses with the kind of practiced ease only the truly corrupt ever master. A few steps away, a junior operative confirmed the final transaction on a secure laptop. A transfer of $82.4 million had been pre-authorized through Banque de Sion. The recipient was a trust in Zurich, buried beneath 3 shell companies. By the time the gold landed, the money would be waiting. Washed, converted, real. No flags, no friction, the tech murmured, completely invisible. They didn't know they were being watched. At that exact moment, in a control room buried 2 floors below ground level, a man in civilian clothing stared at them through a bank of surveillance feeds. His hands didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. On one screen, crates disappeared into the belly of the jet. On another, the minister leaned back, laughing at something Vogel had said. Across the airfield, a technician in a reflective vest double-checked the aircraft's fuel status. It was perfect. Enough for a straight route with a stop in Morocco. Nothing that would raise suspicion. The crew, 2 Swiss pilots, were already on board, flipping through the pre-flight checklist without urgency. The manifest was clean. The flight plan had been approved. No flags, no friction. In every sense, this was the endgame. Everything had aligned. The documents, the bribes, the silence. This wasn't just a shipment. It was a monument to years of careful rot. Planned corruption, so well architected, it almost looked elegant. And the men behind it sat in that lounge believing, truly believing, that they had just pulled off the perfect crime. What they didn't see and couldn't yet sense was the layer beneath the illusion, the cracks behind the mirage. Because far from their champagne toast and whispered banking codes, a separate network had already wrapped around them like a noose woven from silence, loyalty, and rage. The night wasn't calm. It was waiting. 3:55 a.m. The final clearance had just been granted. Inside the cockpit of the Gulfstream G650, the 2 Swiss pilots adjusted their headsets, ran through the last items on the pre-flight checklist, and prepared to taxi toward the main runway. Outside, the final crate had been secured. The cargo bay was locked, the hatch sealed. Everything was on schedule. Then it happened. Without warning, without flicker, without sound. Every light at Ouagadougou International Airport went out. Floodlights, terminal lights, taxiway guides, runway indicators, all blinked off in a synchronized surgical death. The hangars vanished into shadow. The air control tower, once glowing with soft blue backlight, became a silhouette against the starless sky. Even the distant security lights in the parking lot died at once, as though someone had flipped a single master switch somewhere underground. Inside the cockpit, the pilots froze. What the hell was that? I've lost runway visuals. Everything's dark. Check secondary power. Nav systems are fine, but we have no external reference. They radioed the tower. No response. They tried again. Static. In the VIP lounge, the power cut hit like a slap. Screens died mid-transfer. Air conditioning stuttered to a halt. Emergency lights sputtered and dimmed. For a moment, all that remained was the golden glow of champagne in half-filled flutes, and then even that faded into the dark. The Minister of Commerce stood up, nearly knocking over his glass. "Is this a joke?" he snapped. Marcus Vogel didn't answer. He was already dialing his encrypted satellite phone. No signal. Somewhere outside, through the thick glass, an unnatural silence settled. Then from the far side of the airport came a low rising sound, the grinding, metallic rumble of heavy engines. At first it was faint, then it grew. Then it multiplied. Not 1, not 2. A convoy. Military trucks. 6. No, 8. No headlights. Just the deep thunder of diesel engines moving with purpose across the darkened field. Like shadows with teeth. The Gulfstream pilots watched the movement from their window, their hands frozen over the controls. What is this? That's not scheduled ground activity. In the control tower, now lit only by the dim red glow of the emergency system, the chief flight officer fumbled through binders, trying to override the blackout manually. His hands were shaking. Backup systems weren't responding. He tried the comms again. Dead. "How is this possible?" he muttered. "We've got 4 redundancies. This shouldn't even be—" "Sir, the military channel just went dark too." On the tarmac, the Gulfstream sat like a trapped animal, its engines still running, its sleek frame glistening under the moonless sky, now rendered blind and vulnerable. The pilots, trained for emergencies of all kinds, had never encountered a complete visual blackout in an active war zone, let alone in a country officially at peace. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't see. They couldn't move. And they couldn't escape. In the lounge, panic had begun to bloom. The junior operative slammed his laptop shut. Something's wrong. This isn't just power failure. This is coordinated. Vogel's jaw clenched. He looked to the minister. Who else knew about this flight? No one, the minister said, but the sweat down his temple betrayed the lie. The rumble grew louder. Now the trucks were circling the perimeter of the private terminal, invisible save for the vibrations underfoot. Somewhere in the dark, a radio crackled, a single burst of sound before going silent again. The tension became suffocating. Inside the plane, inside the tower, inside every heartbeat now pounding too fast. And above it all, the sky remained black. No sirens, no alarms, just this pressing, unbearable sense that something unstoppable was approaching. One of the pilots stood, moved toward the cabin door. We need to get out of here now. We can't see the runway. We'd be flying blind. Then we wait. We survive. Across the runway, in an unlit hangar marked out of service, Colonel Sal stood with his men, uniforms covered in tarps, radios muted, faces lit only by the dull green glow of analog screens. He checked his watch. Exactly on time. He turned to the soldier beside him. No more talking. No more signals. We move on his command. And when will that be? Sal's eyes narrowed, gaze fixed beyond the hangar doors, toward the jet gleaming faintly in the dark. When he steps onto the runway, a sharp gust swept across the tarmac as the trucks came to a grinding halt, their silhouettes forming a half-moon around the Gulf Stream G650. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and fuel. The pilots inside the jet sat frozen, bathed in the glow of emergency lighting, their instruments still functional, but their will to move paralyzed. It wasn't just fear, it was something greater. Something unseen but undeniable had arrived. And then, through the darkness, a single figure emerged. No convoy, no guards, no entourage. Just one man walking across the open runway under the eerie hush of the blackout. He wore a simple, worn military uniform. No decorations, no hat. Just a man in boots and dusty sleeves, moving with the certainty of a storm cloud. In his right hand, he carried nothing but a sealed brown envelope, thick and heavy with truth. In his left, nothing, not even a weapon. It was President Ibrahim Traoré. Inside the VIP lounge, the mood cracked. The minister stumbled backward from the window. Is that? It can't be. He wouldn't. But he had. Traoré didn't rush. His steps were measured, deliberate. Every eye on the airfield followed him. The pilots, the customs officers, the soldiers hidden in shadow, and above all, the men who thought they had bought silence. He stopped directly in front of the jet, standing beneath the nose of the aircraft. Looking up at the cockpit, the symbolism was perfect. One man standing before a machine built to steal everything. No guns, no screaming, just presence. He raised the envelope, slowly, silently, deliberately, a statement more powerful than any speech. Inside the control tower, someone whispered, "My God, he's doing it himself." Colonel Sal, watching from the opposite end of the tarmac, nodded once, then gave the signal. In the control tower, a uniformed officer, one of Sal's handpicked men, approached the terminal chief and handed over a second envelope, this one already open. Inside was a signed executive order, not a raid, not an accusation, but something more elegant and more lethal. Presidential Directive 017, confiscation of cargo in the interest of national security. It bore Traoré's signature and seal, drafted weeks earlier, reviewed by military legal advisors and independent constitutional lawyers sworn to secrecy. The language was precise. Every crate, every shipment, every item aboard the Gulfstream was now under sovereign jurisdiction. No embassy, no diplomatic status, no financial entity had the right to intervene. It was a trap they had walked into with open arms. Back in the VIP room, a silence like death descended. The minister collapsed into a chair, sweat pouring down his neck. One of the Swiss businessmen began to mutter legal threats under his breath. Another fumbled for his phone. There was no signal. Then the speakers buzzed, crackling once, before Traoré's voice came through. Quiet, calm, undeniable. Every crate on this plane belongs to the people. Not to men in suits, not to offshore accounts, not to the vultures who feed on our silence. He looked directly at the lounge, as if he could see through the glass, through the lies, into their very thoughts. You thought you could rob us blind, but this is where your flight ends. The engines on the jet powered down. No order, no demand, just surrender. And in that moment, on that dark runway, justice didn't scream or roar. It simply stood and was seen. Dawn broke like Judgment Day. At exactly 8 a.m., every television screen in Burkina Faso, from high-definition flat panels in urban cafes to dust-caked radios in remote villages, tuned in to a single broadcast. No intro music, no anchor. Just a camera, trembling slightly, focused on a massive concrete hangar. Military police lined the entrance. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder behind a barricade, their microphones bristling like bayonets, their faces a mix of disbelief and adrenaline. The moment had come. The crates, those anonymous, diplomatically sealed boxes, were about to be opened. Inside the hangar, the air was dry and electric. The president stood silently to one side, arms folded. He wasn't there to give a speech. Not yet. Today, the gold would speak for itself. A pair of soldiers approached the first crate. They pried at the industrial-grade clamps, their gloved hands steady. The tension was unbearable, like unwrapping a coffin at your own funeral. One final pull, and the lid gave way with a thud. Gasps filled the hangar. Even the journalists dropped their microphones. Inside, stacked with chilling precision, were solid gold bricks, each the size of a paperback book, gleaming with a weight that seemed to suck the light from the room. They weren't loose. They weren't scattered. They were arranged as if someone had taken time to organize the theft with pride. And then someone noticed the mark. Engraved in the corner of each brick, plain as truth itself. Topaco, Burkina Faso, state property. The state mine. The one supposedly shut down. The one the government had claimed was too depleted, too costly to run. The one that should have funded hundreds of schools and hospitals. Camera crews zoomed in. The logo filled the screens across the nation. In villages, children pointed in awe. In towns, parents stood still, their hands over their mouths. In one remote province, a teacher reportedly fainted. The gold that could have fixed her leaking classroom roof had been hiding in plain sight, boxed up and prepared for theft. One by one, the crates were opened. Dozens of them, hundreds of bars. The numbers were staggering. Tons of smelted gold. Over $80 million worth. Some soldiers wept silently as they stacked the bricks in neat rows for the cameras. Others stood motionless, their jaws tight with fury. Reporters whispered into their microphones, struggling to translate what they were seeing into words the world could understand. But the people watching didn't need words. They understood. In the marketplace of Koudougou, an old man dropped to his knees in front of a dusty television at a mechanic's shop and murmured, "That's our future. That's what they were stealing." In a crumbling clinic in Dori, a nurse held her hand over her mouth, whispering through tears, "That could have bought us a generator, an ambulance, even gloves." And in a school in Bobo Dioulasso, students sat cross-legged on the floor, no desks, no books, and watched in absolute silence as their education gleamed under the studio lights, imprisoned in steel and greed. Back at the hangar, Colonel Sao stepped forward, holding up one of the bricks. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The camera lingered on him, a soldier who had once slept on bare concrete floors while ministers signed oil deals from hotel balconies, now standing with the undeniable proof that his country had been betrayed, not by invaders, but by its own. The final crate opened with a loud creak. Inside, rather than gold, was a set of forged documents, shipping manifests, fake embassy seals, bank routing instructions to a Zurich account. The evidence was complete, beyond doubt. President Traoré finally stepped into frame. He looked at the cameras, not as a politician, but as a man addressing his people face to face. "This," he said softly, "isn't just metal. It's medicine. It's clean water. It's hope. And today, he continued, his voice rising, it comes back home. The camera didn't cut away, because this wasn't television anymore. It was history. It started with a whisper, then a cheer, then a wave. By mid-morning, the streets of Ouagadougou, normally clogged with smoke and silence, had become a river of motion and noise. People poured out of homes, shops, classrooms, and farms. No one told them to. No one paid them. There were no slogans printed in advance. Just a single, shared instinct. Today they had seen the truth, and they would not go back to pretending. Near the main square, an old woman walked barefoot, holding up a photo of Ibrahim Traoré torn from a newspaper, taped to a stick like a flag. She didn't chant. She just walked, lips moving in prayer. Behind her came dozens of others, fruit sellers, teachers, motorbike couriers, some carrying pots and pans, others drums. What united them was not anger, but something far rarer, vindication. In Ouagadougou, a group of students abandoned class when they saw the gold bricks on the school's dusty television. Their teacher didn't stop them. She followed them. Out into the street they ran, waving chalkboards above their heads with hastily scrawled words. This is for our books. This is ours. Thank you, Mr. President. In the dry plains near Tenkodogo, a cluster of farmers who had once told Traoré about choosing between medicine and seeds gathered around a cracked radio. When they heard the president's voice say, "This gold is hope," they didn't speak. They knelt. One by one, heads bowed. The oldest among them pulled out a tiny framed photo from his pocket, Traoré shaking his hand, and pressed it to his forehead. In every direction, radios blared. Phones rang. WhatsApp groups exploded. People showed neighbors the images they had just seen. Crates of gold, the presidential seal, the man in uniform raising a brown envelope to the sky. From Bobo Dioulasso to Dory, they came. Not in rage, but in unity. Spontaneous protests, joyful riots, marches that felt like weddings. Children wore cardboard crowns. Old men played drums on buckets. Teachers carried signs that read, "This is the president who came to our school." The one who sat on the floor with our children? We remember. In front of Parliament, thousands gathered without a single stone thrown. They waved flags and raised brooms, a symbol of cleansing, of sweeping away the rot. Someone lifted a handmade sign above the crowd. We have been robbed for decades. Today we took something back. The television coverage continued uninterrupted. Reporters wept on air. One couldn't finish her sentence and had to turn away. Another simply said, "This is not just a story. This is a reckoning." In the North, where rebels had long exploited anger to recruit young men, even they paused. There were reports, unconfirmed, but whispered with wonder, that some fighters laid down their weapons and walked to the nearest village just to listen to the news. And amid all the tears and the music and the thousands of handmade posters showing Traoré's face, one feeling rose above all others. Hope. It was raw. It was imperfect. But it was alive. Because for the first time in living memory, the people of Burkina Faso had seen a man in power use power to protect, not to plunder, and they were not about to forget it. That day, the world looked at their country not with pity or warnings, but with awe. And across the land, from the mouths of children to the hearts of elders, the same quiet vow was made. We will not let this be undone. The offers came quickly. A parade, a national holiday, fireworks in the capital. Even international television networks offered exclusive coverage of the man who stopped the jet. Ministers suggested it would be good for morale. Foreign diplomats called it an opportunity to showcase Burkina Faso's new image. But President Ibrahim Traoré said only 5 words. Justice is not a party. There were no banners, no confetti, no televised address from a golden podium. Instead, at precisely 6 a.m. the next morning, before most of the country had even risen, he stood on the steps of the old Ministry of Planning, flanked not by generals or politicians, but by a teacher, a nurse, a farmer, and 2 university students. The crates of gold were no longer in a hangar. They had been counted, documented, and secured, each bar scanned into a public registry. The full inventory was published online in 3 languages, and beside it, something else appeared, a single-page document, signed and sealed, the creation of the National Transparency Fund. Its mission was clear. Every franc recovered from corruption would go directly into education, healthcare, and infrastructure, the 3 pillars of any lasting nation. No cabinet member would have access to it. No single ministry could redirect it. Oversight would be handled by a diverse citizen council, economists, teachers, village chiefs, and opposition leaders alike. "This is not mine to spend," Traoré told the crowd of journalists. "This belongs to the children who sat on classroom floors, to the farmers who chose between food and medicine, to the mothers who gave birth by candlelight." He paused. "We will not clap for justice. We will build with it." And then he stepped down from the podium, not into a motorcade, but into the back seat of an old Land Cruiser, the same one he had driven himself in since the day of the coup. That moment, like the rest of his presidency, was quiet, intentional, purposeful, the kind of leadership that didn't need applause because it was already anchored in service. Within hours, screenshots of the fund's public website went viral across Africa. Activists in Ghana and Senegal reposted the framework as a model. Anti-corruption movements in Latin America cited Traoré's refusal to celebrate as a new gold standard. International development agencies took notice, not because of the gold, but because of the governance. Because what Traoré understood better than most was this: people don't believe in words. They believe in actions they can see. And when gold once meant betrayal, he made sure it would now mean a blackboard in a classroom, a working water pump, a hospital roof that didn't leak. Not because he told them it would, but because he showed them. They expected fury, chaos, show trials, revenge. Instead, it came with paperwork. On Monday morning, as the sun rose over a country still trembling with disbelief, an officer in a crisp brown uniform knocked gently on a polished wooden door in the Ministry of Commerce. "Commissioner Douamba?" he asked softly. The man inside, once a towering figure who approved every trade license in Burkina Faso, adjusted his tie slowly. He had seen the live broadcasts. He had heard the president's voice. And now, without a word, he stood up, reached for his briefcase, and nodded. No one shouted. No handcuffs were needed. A few minutes later, in a villa behind high stone walls, a Swiss businessman in a silk robe opened his front gate to find 4 officers and an interpreter. One of the officers handed him a sheet of paper, then stepped back respectfully. The man stared at it. His hands trembled. The ink seemed to blur in his vision. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Far away in the Customs Directorate, the man who had once stamped thousands of forged documents with smug confidence found his desk empty. A single envelope sat where his gold-plated pen used to be. Inside, a suspension letter, an arrest warrant, and a list of charges. He read it once, then again. Then, without speaking, he sat down and waited. By noon, 3 ministries were half empty. 5 high-ranking officials had submitted their resignations, carefully typed and strangely polite. They didn't admit guilt. They spoke of administrative misunderstandings, of misinterpreted authority. But everyone knew the truth. They were finished. At the National Police headquarters, press vans waited for scenes of drama. There were none. The men arrived one by one, in suits, in silence. They passed through the gates flanked by armed guards. They left behind estates, offshore accounts, and a trail of corruption that stretched across 3 continents. And they entered a system they never thought would touch them. Inside the holding facility, the prison jumpsuits were simple, gray, coarse, and marked with an ID number. No names, no titles, just numbers. A journalist snapped a photo through a distant window. In it, a man who once dined with presidents now sat on a plastic bench, staring at the floor, his tailored blazer replaced by rough cloth. Behind him, another former minister leaned against the wall, as if gravity had doubled its weight on his shoulders. The image would be shared 1,000,000 times online with a single caption, "Nobody is untouchable." That same day, arrest warrants were submitted to Interpol for 2 additional Swiss executives linked to the gold laundering scheme. One had already fled Geneva. The other was intercepted at a private airport just outside Lisbon, trying to board a flight to Dubai. He carried no luggage, only a briefcase filled with hard drives, gold coins, and 3 fake passports. He never made it on the plane. Inside the presidential palace, no celebration was held. Traoré sat with his legal team and reviewed each case line by line. For every charge, he demanded supporting evidence. For every witness, he asked about safety protections. "We don't need to humiliate anyone," he said, "but we must be exact. Justice is not revenge. It's repair." Later that evening, he gave a single instruction to his staff. No parades, no speeches, just the law. And so, under the dimming light of a long-awaited dusk, the men who had once treated the country like a personal bank account now waited in concrete cells. Some still hoped their lawyers would save them. Others understood it was over. But all of them, in some quiet place within, had heard the same whisper rising across Burkina Faso. This time, the gold came home. It started as a whisper, then a ripple, then a wave no border could contain. At exactly 8:12 a.m., less than 24 hours after the gold crates were unveiled on live television, a compliance officer at a private Swiss bank froze a numbered account that had received unusual wire transfers from Burkina Faso 6 months earlier. By 9:03, a second bank, this time in the Cayman Islands, suspended access to 4 corporate accounts registered under Capstone Minerals Lenonoran, a name which now appeared in red across several intelligence networks. And by lunchtime in Hong Kong, the Monetary Authority had issued a hold notice on a boutique wealth management firm suspected of laundering profits from West African resource flows. None of these institutions moved because they wanted to. They moved because they had to. The eyes of the world were watching. International financial watchdogs scrambled to issue statements. Some tried to distance themselves. Others leaned into the storm, but none expected what came next. At 2 p.m. GMT, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, released a statement that stunned observers. In a time of widespread impunity and fiscal opacity, the actions taken by President Ibrahim Traoré and his government mark a new threshold in anti-corruption governance. Burkina Faso is no longer just a story, it is a precedent. 2 hours later, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, followed with praise of its own. The formation of a citizen-led National Transparency Fund is an unprecedented model. It reflects what development should look like when driven by integrity, not charity. Major outlets, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Reuters, even the Wall Street Journal, ran front-page features. Their headlines were variations of the same astonished theme. The gold heist that backfired. Burkina Faso breaks the mold. The coup that chose justice. The BBC aired a full 1-hour special. The president who stood in front of a jet. The New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "When the Global South Led the Fight for Ethics." Even Le Monde, once critical of Traoré's rise through military means, acknowledged, he did not choose democracy to gain power, but he has chosen transparency to keep it. Behind the scenes, phones rang in capital cities. Foreign ministers asked, "Who is this man?" Think tanks scrambled to prepare reports. Lobbyists warned multinationals, don't underestimate what just happened. In a matter of days, Burkina Faso had gone from a footnote in international reports to a case study in moral leadership. And Traoré's name was being spoken in the same breath as Mandela, Sankara, and Mujica, not for political ideology, but for moral courage. At the African Union headquarters, an emergency summit was proposed, not about crisis, but about reform. Delegates from Kenya, Rwanda, and Ghana asked to study the legal architecture behind Burkina Faso's asset recovery. And in a modest building on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the National Transparency Fund's website received over 2 million visits in 48 hours. Visitors browsed line-by-line expenditures, school roofs, medical kits, water pumps, not one franc unaccounted for. An activist in Nigeria tweeted, "They say small countries can't lead. Burkina Faso just led the world." Meanwhile, in Geneva, where executives once toasted to impunity, several began deleting old emails. Lawyers sent panicked messages to clients. A few even reached out to negotiate asset returns voluntarily, a term rarely heard in white-collar crime. But it wasn't just banks and bureaucrats who reacted. At a university in Chile, students organized a teach-in titled Justice Without Borders. In South Korea, a civic tech group proposed a blockchain audit platform inspired by the Burkina Faso Fund. In a township school in South Africa, a teacher rewrote her ethics lesson plan. First slide, Traoré holding the brown envelope. Back in Burkina Faso, the president said very little. He gave no global interviews, no comment on being called a symbol. He simply attended a village ceremony where a water pump had just been restored with gold fund money. As women sang and children splashed each other, an elder approached him. He did not bow. He did not clap. He simply said, "We heard you did not take revenge, that you gave the gold back. That means we are not cursed. We are still worth saving." And Traoré, with a quiet smile, replied, "You were always worth it. They just forgot." He had the world's attention, the people's adoration, the moment to do anything, and that was the danger. In the days following the arrests, ministers, advisors, even generals approached Traoré with whispers of opportunity. "Now is the time," they said. "Consolidate your power, remove the obstacles, silence the opposition. They will only use this moment to weaken you later." One advisor laid it out plainly over a midnight strategy meeting. "Sir, you've done the impossible. They adore you. Use that trust. Change the Constitution. Clean the system. You could be president for 20 years, maybe more." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He sat quietly, staring out the tall palace window. Outside, the capital pulsed with celebration, flickers of candlelight vigils, children waving hand-painted signs, murals of him lifting the brown envelope already appearing on crumbling school walls. He turned back to his inner circle, eyes unwavering. "If this was ever about power," he said, "we already lost." The room fell silent. "No victory," he continued, "is worth losing the soul of a nation." The next morning, he stunned even his closest allies. He announced that the National Transparency Fund, created to manage the seized gold and its reinvestment in public services, would be governed not by his cabinet, not by military loyalists, but by a multi-partisan council. It would include opposition members, civil society leaders, clergy, investigative journalists, and even student union representatives. "We must guard this fund not just from thieves," he said in his address, "but from the temptation that comes when good people hold too much unchecked power." There were protests, not from the streets, but from inside the palace. Some military leaders felt betrayed. "We risked our lives for this," one colonel growled, slamming his fist on a table. "And now you want to share it with people who would have sold us out?" Traoré looked at him with calm resolve. "That's exactly why. If we exclude them now, we become what we overthrew." In an act unheard of in the region's modern history, Traoré personally invited the leaders of opposition parties to the palace, not for interrogation, not for silencing, but to offer them a seat at the table. Cameras flashed as he shook hands with a woman who had once accused him of being a dictator in waiting. She looked confused, suspicious, but when he slid the draft charter of the Transparency Fund across the table and said, "Help me make this clean," her hands trembled. Even the international press was caught off guard. A BBC correspondent, narrating a live segment from the capital, said, "This is unprecedented. We expected a crackdown, not cooperation." Behind closed doors, Traoré's most loyal advisors tried one last time to sway him. "Sir, the people trust you, not them. And if I break that trust now," he replied, "they'll never trust anyone again." He knew the risk. Power shared is power diluted. By opening the fund to oversight from all sides, he gave up control. He made the path longer, slower, less certain, but he made it stronger. Weeks later, the first public budget hearings were streamed online. Citizens could log in, read every expenditure proposal, ask questions, and vote through a secure app. A farmer from Bobo Dioulasso submitted a question about school roof materials. A university student from Wahiguya requested a breakdown of medical supply prices. Every inquiry received a public answer. Traoré watched the live stream quietly from his office. No grand speeches, no flags behind him. Just him, alone, with a notepad. He scribbled 2 words, "Still ours." That night, walking alone through the halls of the palace, he passed the portrait gallery again. Old presidents stared down from their oil-framed prisons, stoic, rich, distant. He stopped before the last empty frame at the end of the hallway. A staffer once joked they'd hang his portrait there someday. Traoré smiled slightly. "Only if we deserve it," he murmured, "all of us." And with that, the man who had once stopped a jet full of stolen gold, who had faced down billionaires, soldiers, and ghosts of the past, turned and walked back into the quiet, uncertain, but righteous path of nation-building. The harder path, the only one that mattered. The sun had just begun to stretch across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. While most leaders might ride in motorcades, escorted and hidden behind tinted windows, President Ibrahim Traoré drove himself, as he always had, in his aging Land Cruiser, dented from old battles and dusted from forgotten roads. As he passed the main square, people waved, but not like they waved to politicians. They waved like family seeing someone they trusted. He slowed at a school. A little boy, no older than 6, stood at the gate in a tattered uniform, raising a tiny hand in salute. Traoré stopped the car. He stepped out, no cameras, no ceremony, and knelt beside the boy. He smiled, tousled the child's hair, and embraced him. The boy said nothing, but his eyes asked a question millions had wondered for years. "Will we be okay?" Traoré simply nodded, and then he drove on. Alone, but never lonely. Years from now, students wouldn't remember the details of the coup or the exact names on the arrest warrants, but they would remember that night without a moon. The story had already begun to spread across Africa like folklore, passed in marketplaces, whispered in classrooms, retold in mosques and churches. The night the president stopped a plane, the man who held an envelope higher than fear. In textbooks, his name began to appear, not as a conqueror, but as a custodian, a symbol of leadership not defined by how much he took, but how fiercely he protected what belonged to the people. Children in Burkina Faso now colored gold bars not as symbols of greed, but as emblems of accountability. In a civics class in Dakar, a teacher wrote on the blackboard, "Ibrahim Traoré, the man who guarded the gold, not for himself, but for his nation." He hadn't rewritten history. He'd simply reminded it what it could be. Justice doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it walks quietly across a runway, holding a brown envelope. It doesn't always come wrapped in victory speeches or celebrated with fireworks. Sometimes it simply prevents a crime, restores what was stolen, and asks nothing in return. And so we ask you now, have you ever seen justice arrive, quiet but undeniable? Have you ever believed that one act of courage could inspire millions? That truth, even in silence, can still thunder across continents? This was not just a story about one man. It's a question to all of us. Will you act when no one is watching? Will you choose what's right when it's hard? Because sometimes the moon doesn't need to shine for the truth to light the way. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers, then acts. Traoré's quiet courage reminds us that real leadership isn't about power, but sacrifice. In a world often darkened by greed, he chose integrity, and in doing so, lit a path others can follow. His story is proof that one honest choice can shift the destiny of a nation. What would you protect, even if no one was watching? Let's talk about the moments that matter most. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.